I'd like to call up Jessica Fanzo as our next presenter. She's the Senior Nutrition Food Systems Officer at the FAO. She's also working at Johns Hopkins University, which happens to be in my hometown, Baltimore. So there you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, oh, these lights. Thanks, everyone, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be back in Bangkok at this very exciting event. I've been asked to talk about diets particularly, and more so in the Asia-Pacific context, stemming from a meeting that we had last year. FAO hosted a regional symposium. So it's building on some of the work coming out of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. So I'll focus my talk mainly on the Asia region, but also bring in a bit of a global perspective. So what are people eating around the world? This is a figure from the Global Burden of Disease project out of the University of Washington, our friend Ashkan Afshin, who's also in the Eat Lancet Commission. And what this shows is really you see a lot of red. You see a lot of red dots. And these are different food groups, healthy foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, etc. And people are consuming too little of those healthy foods. There's a few foods where you see green in different regions, particularly legumes in some parts of Africa, where people are getting enough of those foods. But overall, the global picture of dietary patterns is not a good one. So just as we go through this data, just keep this in mind that the trends are not looking so great. And Corinna Hawkes, who did an excellent job presenting the Global Nutrition Report, also reiterated that. So let's get a bit into the Asia-Pacific region and why it's such a unique region. Well, it has most of the world's population sitting in it. It's a massive population, lots of population pressure points. Food systems within the region are very diverse, some transitioning very rapidly, some less so. We have rural, very deeply urban type pockets of different food system and environments, and very distinct economies and drivers that are shaping those food systems. But inequities exist in the region across both urban and rural food systems and environments. Also, the malnutrition burdens are quite distinct in the region. You have places that are still grappling with significant burdens of undernutrition, other regions with overweight, or other countries with overweight and obesity, and then many of the countries in the region are dealing with double, triple burdens of malnutrition, which make it incredibly difficult for policymakers to figure out what to do with food systems to address that burden. And of course, many different cultures, traditions, religions, social norms around diets and food and eating and cooking and food culture overall. And one of the big drivers that you see in the region is this rapid urbanization, much more so than Africa. Africa will lag behind and become more fully urbanized later. So Asia's moving faster on the urbanization front. There's also a lot of transformations of the agri-food economy. A lot of you have probably read Tom Reardon, Peter Timmer's work, who've really described this transformation very eloquently with urbanization and this post-farm gate segments of the supply chain moving to cities, rural factor market transformation where you have more non-farm employment that's increasing versus farm employment, intensification of farming technology, and these changing diets that we see over time. So Asia is going through massive transformations in its food economy. And what are people in these regions eating? My old slides are in here. So, sorry, you're gonna have to bear with me. Well, the picture is mixed. If you look at the panel on the right side, this is looking at changes in dietary intake in South Asia in blue, in orange is Southeast Asia, and gray is East Asia. And if you look at the changes from 1990 to 2013, it's a mixed picture across these three different subregions of Asia, with fruit being up, in some places whole grains coming up, but also processed meats increasing, sugar-sweetened beverages increasing. So it's a mixed picture when you start to drill down to the sub-regional level. Also, there's trends in the Asia-Pacific of sales of ultra-processed food products and oils. What this graphs are showing you are the sales of ultra-processed foods in different countries in the region: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, Korea as being the high income, and it goes down to the low income like Vietnam, or lower middle income, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. And really looking over time from 2000 to 2017 across those countries, you see an uptick, a swing up in ultra-processed food sales. And you also see an increase in processed food distribution in modern grocery stores in the region as well. So we're seeing an increase in these what's called ultra-processed or highly processed foods that are convenient, and some are very tasty, instant noodles as being one example. So we're seeing this trend in the region. You've seen the burden numbers globally, staggering. Corinna Hawks had presented that. We have a massive global burden of malnutrition, but the region of South Asia, Southeast Asia holds a lot of that burden. In the stunting, 58.7 million children in Southern Asia. If you look at overweight and obesity, Asia, again, holds most of the overweight and obesity in the world in just sheer numbers, and as well as wasting. So Asia has big numbers to grapple with in looking at the multiple forms of malnutrition in children under 5, which makes for very complicated ways to have to intervene. So the burden in Asia is significant. So what are the impacts of diets beyond just this malnutrition burden? Well, the health consequences are also huge. Dietary risk factors are now one of the leading causes of disability and death in the world. And this disability and death has switched from communicable infectious disease to non-communicable disease. So we're seeing a massive change in risk factors that are contributing to disability and death in the world, with the diets, the foods that we are eating, killing us. And this is really a shocking revelation that's come in the last couple of years. So dietary risk factors have significant health consequences, and it's these suboptimal diets, diets high in fat, sugar, salt, low in fruits and vegetables, etc. And if you look just in India and Thailand as an example, dietary risks have come up in the last decade as being higher risk factors than where they were 10 years ago. So it's switching. The risk factors are switching, the types of disability and death are switching. We also have equity consequences of Asian diets. In different countries in the region, people are getting access to different types of foods. Some unhealthy foods, animal source foods can be a real problem to access, which are critically important for early life. And we see the cost of diets being incredibly expensive for some households in the region, with places like Pakistan, a household spending 50–60% of their entire income to meet their minimum diet. So the inequities in accessing and affording a healthy diet are significant. And as Mike just depressed us all completely by showing his slides, the climate consequences, environmental consequences of what we're eating is also putting us and the planet at risk. We're seeing increased demand for animal source foods, places like China, Indonesia, Japan. You're seeing this increase in animal source food supply over the last couple of decades. And this will obviously have some impacts on greenhouse gases as well as other environmental indicators like water footprints, land use, biodiversity loss, etc. So it's something we need to be thinking about. And this was a great paper that just came out in Nature Sustainability, looking at China particularly, and the demand for meat and food intake is really increasing the constraints on the planet: water use, land use, and greenhouse gases. So what can be done? This is my last slide. We know that malnutrition burden is massive, particularly for Asia, and it plays out differently in different countries and even subnationally. And Purnima Menon did a great study looking at India, showing you some of the subnational causes of the burden and why we see these different burdens in different places. The environmental impacts of changing diets and food systems are significant, but many policy actions can be taken. We're seeing rise in policies that are shaping food environments, access to food, school environments where food is being served. There's a lot of things happening. Chile is doing a lot, which all of us saw yesterday. We've highlighted some of these policy actions in the Global Nutrition Report. And consumption matters, behavior change matters, and Purnima Menon in the panel this morning emphasized that. Change is people can change their behaviors, it's malleable. We need to be focusing on not just what we do with governments and the private sector, but also changing consumer demand. Lack of evidence is no excuse for inaction. Martin Bloom talked about that. We need to get going. Action can generate evidence itself. And we need a whole systems approach, a whole food systems approach. We need to be thinking about inequities, climate, human health. We can't think of these as separate things anymore. We need to be addressing them in one holistic way. And I'll end there.